I know just yesterday, one of the members of the House Democrat leadership team, Chairman Nadler, introduced a bill to pack the Supreme Court. This is a proposal that we've seen in other countries. Unfortunately, it's mostly socialist countries. If you look at some of the examples, in 2004, Venezuela dictator Hugo Chavez packed his court, and the result was totalitarian dominance for his socialist regime. Congressman Jimenez, who himself fled Cuba, fled a communist regime, said just recently on court packing, quote, "Packing the court is a tactic used by brutal dictatorships to consolidate the socialist power, which resulted in tens of thousands of court rulings in its favor, basically destroying the country," closed quote. I wanted to ask the gentleman, is that court packing bill a bill that the majority is going to be bringing to the floor or even marking up in committee? And I would yield.
Well, I have not had a discussion with Mr. Nadler, but as the gentleman knows, we have a lot of work to do on the floor of the House of Representatives, and we intend to get that work done. We have not considered bringing to the floor the bill to which the gentleman refers. Did the gentleman in his research find any instances in any authoritarian country where they refused to consider a constitutional appointee to their Supreme Court that the president, with 10 months on his term, sent down to the United States Senate or some other body in those bodies?
If the gentleman yield back, I haven't read the Constitution of Venezuela, but I know in the Constitution of the United States, it actually gives the Senate the advise and consent role, responsibility, as it relates to Supreme Court picks, and obviously that has been kept. We've seen from the Borking
Did the gentleman find
it? And I'll yield for a moment, but you surely have seen in years past, and the Borking incident was probably the most embarrassing, egregious abuse that started this back and forth, where individual Supreme Court picks became more personally scrutinized, and that process has been abused in cases like Bork. Even the Kavanaugh hearing got so out of control, where disgraceful false allegations were made. But in the end, the Senate's advise and consent role is part of the United States Constitution. I don't know if the gentleman's suggesting that should be changed. I don't see it. Even with a Democrat majority right now, I wouldn't suggest changing that process that's in our Constitution.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I don't know about the bill that Mr. Nadler points out, but I do know, Madam Speaker, that the Constitution says nothing about the Senate's ability to simply refuse to consider a appointee of the President of the United States. And I don't think the founders had any concept that that would be the case when they gave the power of appointment to the President of the United States. And then, when that occurred, when the present Attorney General was appointed to the Supreme Court, Mitch McConnell said, "We're not going to consider it." 10 months before the end of the term of a President of the United States. And then they said, the reason being is because we have an election coming up in just a few months. In that case, it was 8 months. In just a few months, and the next president ought to appoint. That deep principle enunciated by Mr. McConnell, by Mr. Graham, and others, who's now was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, that deep principle was abandoned immediately when it became politically pragmatic for the Republican Party to do so and steal a Supreme Court justice. So he can talk about socialism all he wants. What a distraction that is. A failure to want to discuss on the merits the issues. And so what do? They talk about, Madam Speaker, socialism or communism or dictatorship. None of which we have in the United States of America. Now, we just lost a president of the United States that, in my experience, and I've served with many presidents of the United States, was the most authoritarian-seeking president with whom I've served. So I tell my friend, Madam Speaker, that we're going to focus on issues important to the American people. We want to pass a jobs bill to make sure that America is competitive in the 21st century. We want to pass a jobs bill to make sure that families have good jobs, good paying, that they can support themselves and their families. We want to support bills that build America back better. I want to build an America that makes sure that everybody can make it in America, not only manufacture it in America, but make it in America. That's what we're going to be focused on. And we hope that the debate is on the merits of those proposals, not some aspersion of some ideological tinge that they may think their supporters regale at. So, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. And this is the bill. It's only a page and not even 2 pages, not even a page and a half, but the real change in law by the member of House Democrat leadership, Chairman Nadler, says, quote, a Chief Justice of the United States and 12 Associate Justices, any 8 of whom shall constitute a quorum. So in essence, a hostile takeover of the United States Supreme Court, not going through the traditional process that's been in place for over 100 years. And I think the gentleman knows, if you go back historically, the president in power when the Senate was held by a different party, was led by a different party. I can't recall a case in generations where if in the election year there was a vacancy in the Supreme Court, it was filled. And everybody in the country knew that that was an issue in the election of 2016. In fact, it was probably one of the deciding issues that helped elect President Trump, was that there was that vacancy and the public wanted to be engaged in the direction of the country as well as the direction of the court. It was absolutely a debated, heavily debated item in the 2016 presidential election, and President Trump won that election. But again, I've never heard anybody suggesting changing the Constitution to take away the Senate's advise and consent role, but we do see here a bill that was filed just this week by a leader in the Democrat Party to have a hostile takeover of the Supreme Court, similar to what's been done in socialist countries. And I think it's important to point out who's proposed those kind of changes in the past and what it's led to. And I know President Biden himself is on record many times criticizing heavily the idea of packing the Supreme Court. Now, that was before he was president. Now that it would be him that would be able to appoint these extra judges, I don't know if his position's changed, but it's dangerous precedent. It's the kind of precedent that exists in Soviet-style nations. I sure hope it's not here, but Mr. Nadler did just say yesterday, when asked about Speaker Pelosi's position, he said, quote, Speaker Pelosi and others will come along. So I was just wondering if that was something that the gentleman was planning on bringing to the floor. That would be a divisive issue as opposed to things that we could work together, like infrastructure, that would be unifying. And obviously there's a lot of talk about infrastructure. This is something that there's tremendous interest on both sides of the aisle. I know Chairman DeFazio, as well as the ranking member Sam Graves, have had a lot of conversations about things that we could agree on. And I would hope that would be the approach that we take, unlike the bill that over 90% of which had nothing to do with COVID, the $1.9 trillion spending bill, which was hyper-partisan. I hope we approach this in a bipartisan way because, as I've said, there are clearly members on both sides that want to agree on an infrastructure bill and have lots of areas of agreement if we're talking about infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I think most Americans, if you asked them what they thought was infrastructure, I would say roads, bridges, ports, waterways, broadband. Once you get into social policy and Green New Deal type policies or tax hikes that would make America the highest rate above communist China in terms of tax policy. National Association of Manufacturers said that the kind of proposal that's being floated in the partisan approach would kill over 1 million American jobs. And so I appreciate the gentleman from Maryland talked about jobs. Why would we want to approach this in such a partisan way that we would threaten millions of jobs, that we would make America uncompetitive again, and communist China would have a lower tax rate than America? Hopefully we do the bipartisan approach, not the partisan approach. And I would yield to the gentleman to enlighten us on what direction is being approached right now.
The gentleman refers to communist China, apparently wants to follow that example. A communist authoritarian government that owns most of the manufacturing capability in China, not all of it. Ironic in two different debates in less than 5 minutes that the gentleman would point to China as the example of what perhaps we ought to do when their tax policy is approximately 100%, except what they want to allow their citizens to have. Let me just close on that point with the Supreme Court, Madam Speaker, has been packed. I yield.